Welcome to The Debate. So if I tell you a cargo ship was struck by a missile today, your brain immediately asks a very natural question, right? Like, who fired it?
Right. Yeah, of course.
But what if the news you consume every morning is structurally designed to, well, ensure you never ask that question about certain countries while practically forcing you to ask it about others?
It changes how you see the world, without you ever really noticing the mechanism. So today we are looking into the linguistic architecture of media bias. Specifically, we're focusing on how international conflict is framed in news video titles.
Exactly. And we are grounding this in a massive, deeply rigorous data audit. We've been reviewing this really fascinating analytical chat log between an independent investigator and an AI.
It's a huge data set.
It is. The investigator audited thousands of BBC video titles using coverage from CNN, Fox, and NBC as controls, basically, to map out the underlying grammar of how conflict is reported. In looking at this data, I am thoroughly convinced by the investigator's conclusion, which is that there is a recurring grammatical asymmetry in the BBC's headlines that proves a systemic geopolitical bias. So I'll be representing the investigator's stance today.
And looking at that exact same log, I find myself siding with the AI's rigorous pushback. There is undeniably a structural asymmetry, an unevenness in how different nations are talked about. But jumping from that linguistic output to a diagnosis of, institutional bias, I think ignores the messy, complex reality of journalism. So I'll be arguing that this grammatical imbalance is largely a reflection of verification constraints, the fog of war, and just deeply uneven source access.
Well, let's start right where the investigator started, a concept they termed epistemic inequality. It's a slightly academic phrase, but it describes something incredibly grounded.
Right, an inequality in how the truth is established.
Yes, exactly. When you look at the BBC's headline layer, the investigator found that U.S. and Israeli kinetic actions, and just to be clear, by kinetic, we mean physical military force, like missile strikes or ground raids.
Those are consistently granted the status of absolute fact.
Meaning they're written as declarative sentences.
Spot on. You wake up, you scroll your phone, and you see a headline like, U.S. launches new strikes on Iran. It is objective reality. The U.S. is what the investigator calls the subject of history. They take an action, and it is a fact.
But when you look at Iranian actions, right, in the exact same data set, they are relegated to a completely different status. They become a claim, a denial, or this mysterious agentless event. You get headlines like, cargo ship struck by projectile in Strait of Hormuz, as U.S. insists ceasefire holding.
The passive voice is doing an enormous amount of work there.
It absolutely is. The strike has no actor attached to it. And this isn't a one-off. It's a consistent, measurable pattern. The Western allies are granted direct agency, while adversaries are either stripped of their agency through the passive voice or have their actions filtered through words like accuses or claims.
Right.
So the system itself, the workflow that consistently produces this uneven text, is biased in its output.
Okay, but I don't dispute the data itself. The AI in the chat log didn't dispute the data either, It is undeniable that a grammatical imbalance exists.
Okay, so we agree there.
We do. But this is where we have to separate descriptive asymmetry, meaning things just look different on the page, from actual functional framing bias. Let's look at that Strait of Hormuz cluster you just mentioned.
Sure.
The BBC writes, Iran closes Strait of Hormuz, accusing U.S. and Israel of violating ceasefire deal. Yes, the BBC uses the word accusing to distance itself from Iran's rationale. The investigator looks at that and yells, bias. But think about the journalistic environment.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Because the environment doesn't change the grammatical impact on the reader.
But it dictates the grammar. Iranian state media operates in a highly controlled, closed, and frequently propagandistic information environment. When the BBC uses distancing language for an Iranian claim, it is not inherently an act of geopolitical bias.
You're saying it's just caution.
Exactly. It is a reflection of the unreliability of the source material. The BBC cannot independently verify what the Ayatollah's government is claiming. Conversely, when they write U.S. strikes Iran in a declarative tone, they might be basing that on verifiable Pentagon briefings, embedded reporters, or, independent satellite imagery.
Right, right.
Treating different sources differently isn't bias, it's the definition of journalism.
I hear your point about the Pentagon being a verifiable source. But I think that gives Western institutions way too much credit for objectivity, and it completely ignores the cumulative effect of the policy. Think about it like a courtroom.
Okay, let's go to the courtroom.
If a judge runs a courtroom where the defense is constantly required to provide rigorous forensic evidence before they are allowed to make a single claim, but that same judge allows the prosecution's opening statement to be entered into the record as absolute uncontested fact, we would universally agree that the courtroom is corrupt.
Well,
even if the judge says, well, the prosecution just has better paperwork, the standard of evidence is fundamentally unequal. That is the investigator's core argument. Applying a strict skeptical verification standard to one geopolitical actor and a lax trust-based standard to another is an editorial choice.
I'm not so sure it's an editorial choice as much as a practical reality.
It creates an institutional burden of proof bias that reinforces a specific geopolitical hierarchy.
But your courtroom analogy conflates the availability of evidence with the standard of evidence.
How so?
If the prosecution walks into the room with a literal smoking gun and high-definition video of the crime, and the defense walks in with a rumor they heard from an unverified witness, the judge isn't biased for treating those two pieces of evidence differently.
That's a bit of an exaggeration of the discrepancy, though.
I don't think it is. In fact, it would be journalistic malpractice for the BBC to treat an unverified claim from a closed state regime with the exact same grammatical weight as a confirmed multi-sourced event.
But our Pentagon press release is always the smoking gun. In modern warfare, a statement from the U.S. Department of Defense is a highly strategic, crafted piece of public relations.
Sure, they have an agenda.
It is specifically designed to frame the conflict in a way that benefits the United States. Yet the BBC's grammar routinely launders the Pentagon's strategic rationale into objective, neutral context.
How so? Provide an example of laundering.
Okay. Take a look at how they use chronological sequencing to imply moral justification. There's the headline in the data, U.S. launches new strikes on Iran after attack on cargo ship. I want to focus on the psychology of the word after for a second.
It's just establishing a timeline. Event A happened, then event B happened.
On the surface, yes. But human brains don't just process timelines, we process narratives. When a reader scrolling their phone sees U.S. strikes after attack, the brain inherently reads that chronological sequence as causality and moral justification.
You think they read it as a defensive move?
Absolutely. Event B was a necessary, logical, stabilizing response to Event A. The U.S. action is framed as management. Meanwhile, Iran's rationale in other headlines is almost always framed as a random disruption or an unverified allegation. The grammar itself assigns the role of the rational actor to the U.S. and the irrational aggressor to the adversary.
The AI actually conceded that functional framing bias exists within that specific sample.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it agreed that the headline layer displays this epistemic inequality. But this is where the conversation gets really interesting, because we hit the fundamental definition of what bias actually is.
Right, intent versus output.
Exactly. The AI argued that to diagnose a news organization with systemic institutional bias, you have to prove there's a conscious intent to deceive or manipulate.
Which is a massive logical error. That was one of the most profound moments in the chat log, honestly, when the investigator forced the AI to abandon the crutch of intent.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Wait, let me just explain what I mean by that. Media bias is not a conspiracy theory. It doesn't require a smoky room of evil editors twisting their mustaches and plotting to suppress Iran. Bias is an output of the workflow.
Okay, explain what you mean by workflow output.
Think of a factory. If a factory's machinery is calibrated in a way that it consistently produces defective parts on one side of the assembly line, the factory is defective.
Makes sense.
It doesn't matter if the line workers are operating in completely good faith, trying their best, and following the employee manual. The political effect of the headline, the way it shapes the public's understanding of who is the aggressor and who is the victim, remains exactly the same, whether the BBC editor is a conscious propagandist or just a tired journalist blindly following a house-style guide. We have to analyze the function of the text, not the intent of the author.
Okay, I understand the theory, but I look at it completely differently. Let's stick with your factory analogy. Suppose the factory machinery has a perfectly neutral rule. It will only accept raw materials that meet a 99% purity grade. Now, suppose supplier A consistently provides 99% pure materials and supplier B consistently provides contaminated materials. The factory rejects supplier B's materials. Is the factory biased against supplier B? No. The output is an artifact of the environment.
But in this scenario, what is the purity grade?
Verification. If the BBC applies the exact same neutral, objective rule across the board, for instance, we will only print a statement as objective fact if our reporters can independently verify it on the ground, or if it is confirmed by allied intelligence agencies with whom we have historically reliable relationships.
But that historically reliable part is subjective.
Maybe, but the resulting asymmetry on the page is real, but it is an artifact of source access. It is the reality of the fog of war. Calling it institutional bias accuses the BBC of actively desiring this asymmetry rather than merely suffering it.
But wait, if we accept your premise that the BBC is just acting as a passive mirror to the fog of war and that cautious grammar is applied universally when things are hard to verify, how do we explain the data on Russia and Ukraine?
Ah, right.
Because when we look over there, the fog seems to lift entirely.
I'm glad you brought up the Russia-Ukraine control case, because the AI used this exact data to prove that the BBC does not have a blanket institutional rule shielding or condemning specific actors.
I disagree, but go on.
When you look at the Ukraine coverage, the BBC writes headlines like, "Massive Russian attack on cities across Ukraine kills at least 13 people," or "How Russia turns Ukrainians into spies."
Those are very direct.
Exactly. They are direct, declarative, and unhedged. Russia is the clear, unambiguous actor. The verbs are concrete: turns, kills, attacks. This completely dismantles the idea that the BBC's institutional grammar is structurally incapable of assigning hostile agency.
It proves they can do it.
Right, it proves that the BBC house style is fully capable of writing clean, actor does violence to victim sentences when the facts on the ground dictate it.
Well, I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the data actually points the other way. The Russia control case doesn't dismantle the investigator's point. It is the ultimate proof of it.
Wait, how can a clear, direct headline prove that they are biased in favor of hiding agency? That makes no sense.
Because it proves they have the capability. It proves the BBC knows exactly how to write direct, unvarnished agency. They know perfectly well how to write state actor kills victim. So the critical question becomes, why does that capability selectively disappear when the state actor is Israel?
It doesn't completely disappear, though.
It largely shifts. In the data cluster concerning Israel, Lebanon, and Gaza, the BBC selectively moves away from direct agency and embraces what linguists call nominalized agency.
For those not deep in linguistic theory, define nominalized agency.
It means turning an action into a noun, so the actor basically fades into the background. Instead of writing, Israeli strikes kill 47 people in Lebanon, which matches the Russian grammar perfectly right, they write at least 47 killed in Israeli strikes in Lebanon.
Right, the emphasis shifts to the victims.
Yes, the dead are foregrounded, which, sounds empathetic, but look at what happens to the state actor. Israel is turned from the active subject of the sentence into an adjective. Israeli strikes. The agency is softened. The investigator's brilliance here was showing that direct agency and moral justification are distributed unevenly depending on geopolitical alignment. The fact that the BBC is direct about Russian aggression doesn't absolve them of bias, it highlights the discrepancy. If a rigged roulette wheel occasionally lands on red, it doesn't mean the wheel isn't rigged. It just means a systemic bias operates selectively.
But you are cherry-picking the soft headlines.
Am I?
Yes, the AI pointed out that the BBC does write direct headlines about Israel when the events allow for it. The data includes titles like Israel bulldozes Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem or Israel strikes southern Lebanon amid partial ceasefire. These are not hidden agency titles. Israel is the subject. The verb is direct.
But those are the exceptions that prove the rule.
I disagree. The selective alternation you're identifying maps perfectly to the level of certainty and visibility at the precise moment of publication.
What do you mean by visibility?
Think about the physical reality of the events. A bulldozer destroying a home in East Jerusalem is a slow, highly visible, easily verifiable event. There are often multiple reporters and cameras physically present.
Okay, that's fair.
A missile strike in a contested, highly kinetic urban environment like Gaza or southern Lebanon, where the initial casualty figures are being provided by a militant group's health ministry, that requires an entirely different grammatical treatment.
You're blaming the grammar on the chaos of the event.
Yes, the AI was pushing back against the desire to hand down a blanket conviction of the BBC based purely on syntax without acknowledging the physical reality of news gathering.
Look, I think the text alone is more than sufficient to diagnose how the BBC functions as an epistemic gatekeeper. We don't need to know how the sausage is made if we can chemically analyze the sausage and see the imbalance,
That's a vivid metaphor.
And to prove how deep this goes, I want to look at one more mechanism the investigator uncovered. It's one of the most subtle parts of the chat log, and it has to do with agenda setting. Specifically, the use of Donald Trump as a news source.
Ah, yes. This was a fascinating pivot in the data analysis.
When you review the raw data, there is a massive volume of headlines centered on Trump. Now, the AI initially tried to contextualize this by pointing out that the control networks CNN and Fox actually mentioned Trump more often proportionally.
Right, so the AI's first instinct was, the BBC's actually quite restrained.
Exactly. But the investigator pushed the AI to look past the frequency and look at the role Trump plays in the sentence structure. The BBC frequently uses Trump as the quoted source at the very top of the headline layer. You see titles like, Trump says Iran deal will be signed shortly, or Trump tells Israel and Iran to stop shooting.
And on the surface, that looks like perfectly neutral objective grammar. Person X said Y. It is the most basic building block of reporting.
Right, it looks neutral. But imagine scrolling your phone first thing in the morning. Before you have even clicked an article, before you have read any context or analysis, the headline has already granted Trump unparalleled agenda-setting power.
By just quoting him.
Yes. By anchoring the headline with Trump says, the BBC allows his specific framing of reality to bypass any editorial filter and establish the premise of the geopolitical debate for the reader.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the institutional function of that exact phrasing?
What do you mean?
Look at how the American control networks handle it. Fox News uses emotive, evaluative language. They write, Trump demolished Iran's capabilities. CNN uses adversarial framing. Trump's war powers rebuked.
Right. They have their own flavors of bias.
But the BBC avoids both the cheerleading and the overt hostility. Their use of Trump says, or Trump claims, is the precise institutional grammar required to report on a major world leader's statements without endorsing them as objective truth.
But it still centers him as the prime mover of reality.
It's a distancing mechanism. When a former or current U.S. president makes a statement about a global conflict, it moves markets, it dictates troop movements. It is inherently newsworthy.
I'm not saying they shouldn't report it.
But they have a journalistic mandate to report it a specific way. By putting it in quotes and explicitly attributing it to him, they are isolating his narrative from the BBC's institutional voice. They are saying to the reader, this is his claim, not our established fact.
But linguistically, the distancing fails because he still owns the sentence. Look at the specific headline from the data. Trump claims deal to end Iran war near, but Tehran says nothing finalized. Yes, they use the word claims to distance themselves, but look at the structure.
Okay, break it down.
Trump is the subject of the independent main clause. His claim anchors the entire concept of the sentence. Tehran's reality, the actual state actor involved in the war, by the way, is reduced to a dependent clause that only exists to react to Trump. The investigator's analysis beautifully highlights how systemic bias doesn't look like Fox News-style shouting.
It's much quieter.
It's completely quiet. It operates through causal clauses, source hierarchy, and grammatical role assignment. The BBC grants U.S. and allied actions a framework of management and response using implicit concepts like retaliation, self-defense, and enforcement, while adversarial actions are framed as isolated threats, unverified accusations, and disruptions to the Western order.
Look, I will readily grant that the investigator pushed the AI to a much sharper, more profound understanding of the text. By the end of the chat log, the AI did concede a corrected finding.
Right, it had to adjust its stance.
It acknowledged that within these specific conflict clusters, the BBC's titles frequently give U.S. and allied actions a response frame, while adversary actions are framed as tests of diplomacy or unverified claims. That credibility hierarchy, that epistemic inequality, is real.
Which validates the entire audit.
It validates the linguistic findings of the audit. But the AI rightly maintained a crucial analytical boundary. This is a structural framing asymmetry at the level of published text. It demands an explanation. Absolutely.
But
to equate that linguistic output directly with systemic institutional bias without investigating the physical mechanics of news gathering, the literal phone calls made to intelligence agencies, the lack of reporters able to safely operate in Tehran versus the press access in Jerusalem, I mean, that is jumping to a conclusion that text alone cannot entirely support. Descriptive asymmetry does not automatically equal institutional propaganda.
well, to summarize where I land on this, I think the investigators' relentless pushback in that chat log successfully proved the case. The BBC's headline layer is not a transparent window into global events. It functions as an epistemic gatekeeper. By routinely, structurally framing Western kinetic actions as objective reality and adversary actions as claims or passive events, the workflow produces a systemic geopolitical bias. It fundamentally doesn't matter what is in the individual editor's heart. The political effect of the language is that Western allies are the subjects of history and everyone else is just an object of analysis.
And to summarize my position, I believe the AI provided the necessary analytical restraint that the human investigator lacked. Yes, the data audit revealed a highly impactful structural asymmetry in the grammar of international reporting.
Definitely.
When we read the news, we absolutely need to be aware of how passive voice and causality shape our perceptions. However, diagnosing institutional bias strictly based on a statistical analysis of vocabulary without accounting for the severe constraints of source access, regime transparency, and battlefield verification is an incomplete analysis. The fog of war is real, and it bends the grammar of those trying to report through it.
You know, what I genuinely appreciate about this source material is watching the friction between human intuition and rigorous data modeling. By pushing the AI past surface-level grammar, the investigator forced a really uncomfortable conversation about how reality itself is constructed through language.
It definitely changes how you interact with your morning news feed. When you start noticing these patterns, the softened agency, the chronological justifications, it becomes impossible to unsee. It leaves you with a lot to chew on regarding your own analytical threshold for what constitutes bias versus what constitutes caution.
It brings us right back to the idea of a window. For years, you might look through the glass of your daily news feed, assuming you are just seeing the raw, unfiltered facts of the world on the other side.
Right.
But once you notice the curve in the glass, once you see how a single structural choice like after or says bends the light of causality and blame, you can never look through it the same way again. The question we are left with isn't whether the glass is bending the light. The question is, who shaped the lens and what reality are they making you see?